Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 8 months after the elections, what should we make of the second Modi government? How should we view the nationwide protests that have continued for 6 weeks without break? What is the future of the Congress party, and has the Supreme Court let us down? Those are 4 key issues I shall raise today with a man that many consider contemporary India's most profound political thinker, Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, I want to talk to you first about the second Modi government, which is 8 months old. And before I come to specific issues, let me begin with your overall view of this government, which you wrote about just 3 weeks ago in the Indian Express. You write, India is governed by a regime whose sole raison d'etre is to find an adversarial rallying point and crush it by brute force. It now legitimizes itself not by its positive accomplishments, but by using the enemy as a rallying point. That is a pretty serious indictment of the government. Can you explain what's brought you to this conclusion?
Well, the first thing is the government's own words. I mean, one of the astonishing things about this government is how it indicts itself on the score. If you look at the speeches of the Prime Minister and the dog whistles he gestured at, that we can identify protesters by the clothes they wear. If you look at the speeches of senior ministers, most recently the Minister of State of Finance, the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, you have written about it this morning. It's literally a who's who of this government, basically declaring as openly as they can that they want to play a politics that's divisive, that they want to incite violence, and they want to gesture, or at least make it clear that minorities are second-class citizens in this country. And the targets perpetually shift. It's not just minorities, it's universities, anybody who dares to call themselves liberal, making secularism a bad word, making now even, I think, building up a kind of paranoia towards a foreign project to break down India, and the implicit assumption being that lots of Indians are in cahoots with that project. So they indict themselves by their own words. I mean, frankly, you and I don't have to actually find any evidence for that. And secondly, and more substantively, which is if you also look at the policies they're pursuing, if you take the full arc of policies that this government, the second Modi government, has pursued, from the abrogation of Article 317 Kashmir to their celebration of the Ayodhya judgment, in all fairness, it's a judgment given by the Supreme Court, to now the Citizenship Amendment Act, there is a consistent thread running through these policies, which is to establish the fact that India is becoming a majoritarian democracy.
You've said a lot there. Let's explore those points one by one. In the article you wrote for the Indian Express, you discussed 3 specific adverse consequences of having a government like this. The first was that you believe this government has a deliberate strategy to divide people and thus remain in power. Your words were, the government's strategy is not to solve old issues, it is to divert attention by bringing in new adversaries in the hope that we remain divided. Were you simply there referring to its Hindutva agenda, which sees Hindus as special and Muslims as alien, or were you talking about a much wider, broader point about the government?
So I think the government has 3 distinct agendas, which are related in a package, but I think it's useful to break them down. So one is the Hindutva agenda, right, which is how do you consolidate India as a Hindu majoritarian democracy. The second agenda is how do you legitimize authoritarianism, right? And authoritarianism in a specific sense, which is how do you legitimize the fact that institutions no longer protect civil liberties as arduously as they did. In fact, you dismiss all talk of civil liberties as being anti-national in some ways. So there's authoritarianism. And the third is, I think, the reconstruction of modern Hinduism, which is something I think we don't pay enough attention to, which is to convert Hinduism from a religion that upholds certain values, whatever one might think of them, into a category of ethnic identification, right? And in order to produce all of these 3 things, right, it needs an enemy. So why do we need Hindu majoritarianism? the argument is that in the absence of a consolidated Hindu identity, somehow India will be under threat because minorities will exercise veto. How do we reconfigure Hinduism into this political force away from its, you might say, spiritual core? It is by actually denigrating pretty much anything that has to do with learning or higher values. How do we legitimize authoritarianism? By portraying any act of dissent, right? Whether it comes from university students, whether it comes from professors, whether it comes from lawyers, whoever, any act of dissent as potentially nation-breaking.
And this is why slogans like Anurag Thakur, which you referred to a moment ago, Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salo ko, or statements by Parvesh Singh Verma, another MP, they were talking of Shaheen Bagh,
yes,
that
right.
they will rape your daughters and sisters, or the vilification of Shaheen Bagh by Amit Shah and Ravi Shankar Prasad. These are indications that this government is seeking to divide. It is majoritarian in its attitude, it's authoritarian in its approach to governance, and it is also, as you said, refashioning Hinduism.
It is refashioning Hinduism and frankly openly calling for violence. I mean, this is about as straightforward a call for violence you can get. I mean, the last time, right, I mean, if you want to, since we are speaking on 29th January, Goli Maro Gaddaro ko led to Gandhi's assassination, right? So it is almost a wish for a kind of militarization of Indian civil society in a way that is unprecedented.
When Adityanath says, as he did, that people who call for Azadi should be treated with sedition, actually it's government ministers who are inciting violence and are actually liable to be prosecuted for sedition, provided someone has the guts to do so.
Absolutely. I mean, they're guilty of violating so many laws. I mean, even if you think sedition is a bad law, incitement, hate speech, violation of election protocols. But I think more seriously, I mean, I think the bigger question I think all of this raises is these are seasoned politicians, right? And you have to grant them the fact that they have come on the backs of a major electoral victory. What does it say about us as a democracy at this point that these politicians have the confidence, not just that they can get away with saying these things, but somehow saying these things is actually going to be a way of consolidating power behind them? I think that's a question, that's a difficult question we have to confront.
And that, in a sense, points towards us, the Indian people.
Right. Us, the Indian people, yes.
And
indeed.
it does suggest that somewhere within us,
Right.
there is also an infirmity because we are accepting and tolerating this government, not perhaps doing enough to oppose it.
We are accepting and frankly, we are looking for almost any and every excuse to give it a clean chit in some ways. I mean, I think
So we're complicit.
we are complicit. I mean, I mean, I have to say it's hard to deny the fact that we are complicit, and particularly those sections of Indian society that are otherwise so privileged, powerful, and vocal. I mean, I think one of the big shocks of the last few months, perhaps we should see it coming, is the abdication of the responsibility of the middle classes, civil servants, judicial officers, judges, frankly corporate India, a range of actors who are otherwise so empowered to speak and make their voice felt.
So those who have the position, the education, the economic background to stand up and speak, to criticize and oppose, are silent. They're letting the country down.
Well, they're silent. That's a benign way of putting it. I think in the case of particular institutions, right, Supreme Court, for example, it's more than silence. It's almost giving an imprimatur or putting their imprimatur on these kinds of claims and activities simply by abdicating their official responsibility.
Which means either these sections, and you name them, are cowardly and can't stand up, or they actually believe what the government is doing is correct and therefore are not opposing it.
As I say, either of the data is consistent with both of those interpretations.
Which means that critical sections of India are letting down India. We're letting down our democracy. We're letting down our principles.
No. Critical sections of India are letting down democracy, and the American political scientist Myron Wiener once made a rather profound remark. He said, "Look, societies never destroy their own institutions. Elites often destroy their own institutions."
And the elite in India is allowing the institution to be destroyed by the government because it's not standing up.
It is absolute. It's not standing up, and in some cases openly collaborating.
You wrote about this in a sense in that Indian Express article I referred to. You said, in fact, that this was an apocalyptic vision, and you added the worst indictment of India is that the government thinks the people are behind it. You've identified the elites who are either complicit or cowardly. But what about the majority of rural India? Are they with the government? Is their silence a suggestion that they agree, or are they silent because they haven't had an opportunity to speak out?
I'll be honest, this is a hard one to diagnose, right? One way of thinking about this question is asking the following question, which is, what is happening in Uttar Pradesh right now? Frankly, Uttar Pradesh looks like it's going to be this big black hole of Indian democracy, right? The state has unleashed all its persecuting power. It's not the state where you're seeing the kinds of effective protests that you are actually seeing, at least in places like Delhi and Bombay and Bangalore, right? Is there a quiet consolidation happening behind Yogi Adityanath? A consolidation that still does not involve the majority of the people, because they'll probably get 39–40% of the vote share, but a consolidation big enough to make sure that they retain power, right? Now, if one were charitable, one would say that, look, the political space is still there. 60% of Indians still don't vote, which doesn't mean the government is not legitimate. That's the nature of the first past the post system. And one of the big challenges for the people of India is that they are struggling to find an alternative to latch on to, or to put it a different way, the opposition is so divided and so busy undercutting itself in different ways that it actually allows the consolidation behind the BJP to be far more consequential than it otherwise might have been.
That's a very interesting thing. You're saying either UP has consolidated itself behind Adityanath, 35, 38, 39%, or the remaining 60% are still struggling to find a way of expressing their difference and looking for an alternative, and their failure to do either is allowing the consolidation behind Adityanath to look more consequential.
Absolutely. I mean, it's allowing it to look more consequential, and frankly, providing no source of active, effective resistance on the ground to it.
So by default, Modi and the BJP win.
So by default, Modi and the BJP win. Absolutely.
I want to come back to two other consequences of the sort of government we have, which you mentioned in your Indian Express article. The first is its attitude to those who disagree with it as well as those who oppose it. You say, when you legitimize yourself entirely by inventing enemies, the truth ceases to matter. Normal restraints of civilization and decency cease to matter. All that matters is the crushing of real and imaginary enemies by hook or by crook. The state will encourage violence against anyone who is not in tune with it. This is the exact opposite of democratic tolerance. This is a complete disregard of the fact that you must accept and respect both dissent and difference.
It's a complete disregard of individual rights and civil liberties. I mean, I think one of the things that emboldens them is their understanding of democracy. They actually think, or they want to reduce democracy to a form of electoral empowerment, which they undoubtedly have. I mean, there's no point denying the fact that they came with what was an unprecedented mandate, at least in the context of recent Indian history. But they have concluded from that fact that therefore that licenses them to curtail civil liberties. More importantly, I think to seed a culture in civil society through a range of organizations, activities, that frankly are doing nothing but spreading poison. I mean, I think one of the big challenges is going to be, even if the BJP were to lose tomorrow, right? How are we going to stitch back together civil society, right? Once this poison of communalism and authoritarianism has been injected in it.
That's the point I want to take up, because in your Indian Express article, it was the third serious consequence of having a government like this. You spoke about what it does to the people the government is ruling. You write, it annihilates our will, our reason, our spirit, so that we all become willing supplicants in its ideological project. You sort of suggest there that if this government continues for long enough, the very character of the Indian people could be changed.
That's the nightmare we are looking at. This government has a long time to go. It's almost 4 years. And frankly, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be the imminent prospect of displacing it. But given the systematic way in which it is actually now going about trying to reconstruct every aspect of Indian society, right? We've already talked about the way in which it has captured public institutions, right? To the point where public institutions are no longer able to discharge the basic constitutional duties they are supposed to. It is certainly capturing civil society in different ways, and you have to give it to them. I think their civil society organizations have a kind of energy and outreach and financial backing and powers of, if you want to put it uncharitably, propaganda that is simply unmatched at the moment. They've got a lock on major financial resources. They've been able to in a sense, subordinate corporate India to their interests, right? They have been able to align a whole range of religious leaders in this kind of political project. So with this kind of systematic remaking of different sections of Indian society, right? I mean, one of the things we used to think about Indian society is that politics dances lightly on the surface, while, you know, Indian society goes about its kind of merry, organic way. In some ways, what the BJP represents is actually an assault on that kind of organic freedom and vernacular practices of accommodation of Indian society. It is, in some senses, very revolutionary in its aspirations. And like all revolutions, right, wants to remake society in every aspect.
And this, you fear, could be to the detriment of the character of the Indian people, to the sort of society we are, even to the sort of values we once upheld in our constitution.
It is, yes, it's certainly a betrayal of what the constitution represents. I think it's a betrayal of what we thought of as the finest in Indian culture. I mean, God knows Indian culture has a lot to answer for. But what we thought of as the finest Indian culture, which is practices of accommodation that honors people's diversity, individuality, and freedom. And I think more alarmingly, societies take a very long time to recover after a prolonged shock like this.
Let me at this point then put to you two opinions the Indian people often express when they talk about the government. Critics of the government say it's fascist. Is that term being used correctly or incorrectly?
Well, you know, we can get into a terminological debate about the kind of technical, historical uses of the term fascism. I think what's important is to, in a sense, focus on the elements that one would attribute to a fascist government. So does the government target particular communities simply because of who they are and in terms of the identity of those people?
Clearly this does.
Clearly the answer is yes. Does the government encourage its own organizations to promote a culture of aggressive, almost masculine violence? It ticks that box off. Does the government use its power to intimidate independent institutions who could protect the individuality and dignity of citizens and their freedoms? Absolutely correct. Does the government want an India where everyone marches to the same tune?
Clearly
right? It clearly it does. Now, if you add all of this up, it sounds pretty close to fascism. Whether the fact that we still run open democratic elections mitigates its fascist character, that's something you can debate.
I don't want to offend people by saying that Hitler came to power through an open, genuine election and acquired power through an enabling act passed by the Riksdag.
None
of that undermines the fact he was considered fascist.
Absolutely. I think what defenders of the government would say, I think, is that popular legitimation, right, continued popular legitimation, is still very important to the identity of this government, and that we are being unfair to it if we simply dismiss that continued popular legitimation as a sideshow. I don't agree with that argument, but I'm just laying that out.
Let me put it like this. No doubt this government is committed to winning elections and wins them very effectively. But that apart, in terms of all the other checklists that you went through, even if you can't call this government technically fascist, colloquially, the phrase is not incorrect.
No, absolutely. Colloquially, the phrase is not incorrect, and I think the evocative power that we associate with fascism, I think, does need to be invoked at this point.
The second opinion often expressed about this government is this compared to Indira Gandhi's emergency. Are there similarities there, or is that an unfair and exaggerated comparison?
So there are similarities and differences. One, actually, in some ways, this government is more insidious. It's more insidious because, at least with emergency, Indira Gandhi had to go through a formal protocol of declaring an emergency, right? There was a single point agenda in the emergency, which was to consolidate state power behind her and make sure that she wasn't sort of challenged by independent institutions. But what this government has, as I said, added on to that, right, is a much more ambitious project of communalization. So communalization plus authoritarianism is a far, far more insidious project.
And you're saying something else. You're looking at the intent behind what Indira did and the intent behind what Modi is doing. Her intent was to consolidate power behind herself and ensure she continued and wasn't overthrown by a high court verdict. His intent, you're suggesting, is to consolidate majoritarianism and authoritarianism and to enforce some form of Hindutva.
Exactly, right? So in that sense, it's a far more insidious project. Now, if you went into statistical comparisons, right, have we come into an era of mass arrests? Now, people in Kashmir might beg to differ. Perhaps some districts of UP might beg to differ. But we can quibble about those. But there is no question that this combination of authoritarianism and communalism is far more insidious than what we experienced in the 1970s.
Against that background, let me now put to you two of the most contentious and controversial decisions this government has taken in the last 6 months. The first is the decision to deoperationalize Article 370 as well as to divide and demote Jammu and Kashmir into two separate union territories. The government claims this is not just justified, but the Prime Minister says it should have happened 70 years ago. On the other hand, many people say this is a clear breach of the terms and promise made to Kashmir when it acceded in 47, and secondly, it's been done unconstitutionally. What's your view?
So look, we have to begin by acknowledging the fact that when it comes to Kashmir, no constitutional niceties live up to the kinds of anomalous situations that we have created in Kashmir. Frankly, the history of Kashmir is a history of betrayal of promises of all kinds and all different sides, right? So in that sense, there's nothing unprecedented about the abrogation of Article 370.
This is one more betrayal.
This is one more betrayal, and frankly, one of the ironies of Article 370, Article 356 was the very articles that were meant to give Kashmir more autonomy actually enable the centre to exercise extraordinary power over them. So we can keep talking about the form, right? The core issue is this, which is let's not deny the fact that we had a political problem in Kashmir ever since independence. Its integration into India, if you want to call it that, was both constitutionally and politically ambivalent at best, right? And the question always has been, what steps will you take that if they are going to remain part of the Indian Union, they do so willingly in a way in which, right, has support of ordinary Kashmiris, right? The form in which the state has intervened in Kashmir politics over the years, you know, Nehru also had arrested Sheikh Abdullah. It's kind of ironies, Farooq Abdullah, both Farooq and Omar are still under house arrest. So it started a pattern of engagement with Kashmir, right, which over a series of missteps deepened the alienation. What happened over the last 10 years before the BJP came to power is there was a little bit of a window, right, where at least we started having somewhat free elections in Kashmir, where there was a period of a somewhat ambivalent adjustment, right, with the Indian Union. And what this step has done at one stroke is set that clock back immeasurably. We cannot now look any Kashmiris in the eye and say, you have reason to trust us. You compound that with the fact that you have not just abrogated civil liberties in Kashmir, put the state under what in modern terms would be a virtual lockdown. Again, not entirely unprecedented, right? With what moral right will be able to conduct a dialogue with Kashmiris?
So you're saying more than the unconstitutionality, it's the morality and the betrayal of trust that is really what's been damaged.
Exactly, the morality, the betrayal of of trust, and the constitutionality actually, in a sense, matters, because what it does imply is there's now no reason for even other states in different ways to actually trust the spirit and the letter of our constitution. In fact, I think the ramifications of that constitutional abrogation are going to be experienced in lots of other states in years to come.
Let me then bring up the second contentious, controversial decision, and that's the Citizenship Amendment Act. Many people say that it not only breaches the Constitution's commitment to secularism, which is said to be part of the basic structure of the Constitution, but in addition, it negates Article 14's guarantee of equal treatment under the law. In response, the Prime Minister has said it's 1,000% correct, and he adds the Act illustrates India's centuries-old culture of acceptance, harmony, compassion, and brotherhood. What's your view?
So look, it's very simple. There is no denying the fact that India needed to create a pathway for refugees from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from lots of different parts of the world to citizenship, right? And a true reflection of our compassion would have been if we had a refugee law, right, that listed out in secular terms what the criteria were on the basis of which refugees in India were granted citizenship, a pathway to citizenship, right? Such a law would have also included many of the groups that the Prime Minister wants included, right? But the fact that you draft a law that for the first time names only specific groups
And three specific countries.
and three specific countries as the basis of granting that citizenship is clearly a betrayal of secularism. It's designed to single out one community, both ways, right? One by excluding Muslims, and second by implying that it's only Muslim states that are by definition persecutory, right? It's sending a very, very clear signal, right, that this is a state that has no compunction in discriminating on the basis of religion.
And that, of course, accords with the communalist majoritarian agenda of the government that we've been discussing.
Right, absolutely.
What about something else? Many people say that the combination of the Citizenship Amendment Act along with the threatened National Register of Citizens will not just target Muslims specifically, but it could ensure that some, if not many, become illegal citizens and are then either deported or relegated to detention camps. The government refutes this strenuously. They insist that this is based on a misreading. Is the government right, or is the government trying to pull the wool over eyes?
Well, it is trying to pull the wool over its eyes. In fact, the association between the NRC and CA was actually made by none other than the Home Minister himself, in a sense, in a number of speeches, right?
In Parliament and on television.
In Parliament and also. So again, we can use their own words to indict them. But there are two other contexts, right, to this. One, we've had a trial run of the NRC process in Assam, albeit under the supervision of the court. And no matter which side of the political divide you are on, the way the process has panned out in Assam, right, has made it absolutely clear that if you were to conduct a nationwide NRC in India, you would get both type 1 and type 2 errors. Lots of people who are citizens of India will be excluded because they'll be unable to prove their citizenship. On the other hand, there's no guarantee that in this process you will actually be able to exclude many of those who you think you want to exclude, right? So that's one problem. The second problem is you need a policy that squarely confronts the fact that if you were to do an NRC, large numbers of people will not be able to prove their citizenship. And what would you do with those people? What the government is making very clear is that if somehow you could prove that you're Hindu, or state that you're Hindu, you will get preferential treatment.
Or Sikh or Christian
or Sikh or Christian,
or
yeah, exactly,
Parsi.
or Parsi. But if you're Muslim, you would be at a disadvantage in seeking any kind of redress for your situation.
So once again, the combination targets and singles out Muslims. They would be the only ones who would not be brought back into the fold.
Absolutely.
So the government's strenuous refutation, as you said, is pulling the wool over eyes.
It is pulling the wool over our eyes. It's also pulling the wool over our eyes because it's denying, for example, the fact that it's building camps. Well, it has to be more transparent about what it would do in the eventuality that the NRC finds a significant number of Indian citizens, as it will, cannot actually prove their identities as Indian citizens.
But in this instance, if it was transparent and honest and acknowledged the camps,
right,
it would give the game away.
It would give the game away. And if you wanted to do a sincere NRC process, you would actually not align it to a religiously tinged CAA in the first place.
Absolutely. Right. So far, we've discussed what I call the political crisis that embroils India. But the country also faces a very dire economic situation. Growth has virtually collapsed. Investment is flat, unemployment is rising, government revenues, tax revenues in particular, are sharply down this year. And now, most recently of all, inflation is surging. Many people say this is a crisis. The government, on the other hand, says this is just cyclical and it will soon correct itself. How do you view it?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist, and I think given how wrong we have been in the recent past, thinking about the trajectories of the economy, I think a certain kind of humility is warranted. But let's put it very simply. If it's cyclical, it's turning out to be a very long cycle. So, I mean, cyclical usually means a year, 2 years. But pretty much since the government took power, in fact, I'll make the stronger argument. We moved back to India in 2001 first. And I think it's fair to say that from 2001 up until 3 or 4 years ago, the underlying consensus was that India's reform trajectory might be slow, but the direction, broadly speaking, is the correct one. And the kind of growth rates India can take for granted, the debate used to be whether it will be 6.5% or 8.5%. Right? This was a period of profound optimism about the Indian economy. I think it's fair to say that that underlying optimism has almost completely disappeared. Now the debate is, will we be 3% or 5%? Maybe 3% or 5.5%, right? That itself is an indication of the fact that we actually don't see this as just a kind of year-to-year cyclical dip.
In which case, let me ask you this. Do you think this government has the economic understanding and the resolve to tackle the problem, or do you believe it's in denial of the extent and of the nature of the problem, which is why it's not going to be able to tackle it?
I think two things. One, it is to a certain extent in denial. And I think the best manifestation of the denial is just how much political attention are you devoting to that problem, right?
Very little, it seems.
Very little. And particularly a problem as complex as fixing an economy in such deep structural crisis actually requires all hands on deck, right? It's almost also made it clear that it doesn't seem to care. It's open contempt for investment. It's open contempt for corporate India in some ways. I think is one small measure of that. That's one constituency everybody thought this government would serve. There's no evidence that it is putting in place processes, right, that could actually help resolve this kind of problem. Most of its interventions are ad hoc. Too much capital is expended on Pyrrhic victories like we've gone up in the ease of doing business, which even the World Bank will tell you doesn't tell you anything about
and it can be gamed very easily.
About your economic projects. So by and large, I think it has, in a sense, taken the view that this is not something that requires sustained, intelligent attention.
Let me then ask you this. If things continue the way they are, and I'm talking both economically as well as politically, what will India look and feel like 2-3 years down the road?
No, I'm afraid we are back to the conflictual days of the late 70s and early 80s, right? What was it that characterized that decade? Large amounts of civil society protest, particularly among students, labor, and I have to say frankly that it's the first time that we are feeling almost in 15, 20 years. It's very hard to look at the current generation in college and be confident in our assertion to them that, look, your future will be better than ours was, right? And in fact, I think under the surface, you're beginning to see some of that resentment, I think, express itself and latch on to something like the CAA protests, right? So you're going to have a lot of protest of that kind, there's no question. Second, remember the big crisis with Indira Gandhi came not just with the emergency, it came also in the early 80s, where India had more secessionist movements on its hand. You had Punjab, right? One of the most extraordinarily worrying things about India at the moment is that more and more states will find there is less and less reason to be reasonable with the central government about its laws and policies.
So you're going to have federal central conflicts.
So you are actually going to have increased federal central conflict. Now, some of those could be productive, that could restore a balance of power, right? But I'm afraid in a state like Bengal, it may not always take the form, right, of a peaceful constitutional negotiation. Right?
But you're saying a very important thing. You're really suggesting that our future is actually sliding backwards from where we've come.
I mean, we are erasing all the gains of the last 15, 20 years.
In which case, let me ask you this, is our democracy, and I don't just mean the right to vote, I mean our wider, deeper, broader liberties and rights, is that also under threat?
That is already under threat. It's not that it's a potential threat. I mean, I think, you know...
But that's not a long-term threat?
It is a long-term threat. Look, the fact that without declaring an emergency, the courts can refuse to hear or entertain habeas corpus petitions. I mean, you know, both of us are admirers of English law, and I think the cornerstone of a legitimate state is its deference to the principle of habeas corpus, right? I mean, that's the more... If a state were to do nothing but that, right, it would enhance its moral credibility a lot. That's the very thing, right, that we cannot no longer take for granted.
In which case, let me ask you upfront about the Supreme Court. It's not just that the Supreme Court seems to be utterly unconcerned and hasn't heard any of the habeas corpus cases that came up with relation to Kashmir, but it delayed for 5 months hearing the Article 370 case, which concerned fundamental constitutional issues. And it's not going to take up the CA case, which concerns equally fundamental issues, for another 4 weeks. What do you make of this attitude of the Supreme Court?
So I think there are two things here. One, I think we have to be honest, and as Justice Learned had once said, that any democracy that looks to the courts to save it is probably already doomed, right? And certainly the courts have overstepped on many occasions in questions that are fundamentally political. I think what's striking and shocking about this moment is two things. One, that the court has abdicated on issues that should be central to its mandate, as I said, the protection of individual rights, freedom of expression, and so forth. Second, and most shockingly for the Supreme Court, that there have been high courts that have been interestingly providing some modicum of protection occasionally to petitioners. And often you actually find the Supreme Court is even more regressive than many of our high courts are. Third, by delaying hearings, I mean, we all know cases take a long time in the Supreme Court. But once the process is on, it at least gives a semblance of confidence to citizens. There's at least a forum where some principles can be aired.
Here, even the process hasn't started.
Here, the process hasn't started. It was absolutely shocking that the Chief Justice of India says, let the protest die down, then we will hear the case. Whereas actually it should be the reverse. The protests are happening in the first place because people have given up on the idea that there is actually a fair court available to them to actually hear such important matters of principle.
Many people say that the court today, I'm talking specifically about the Supreme Court, is showing the sort of pusillanimity it showed in the 75-76 period when the emergency was on. Would you agree with that?
Again, I would actually argue it's far worse. I mean, at least in 1975-76, there was an official proclamation of emergency, right? I mean, at least there was a deference to form.
That hasn't
happened. Now there's not even a deference to form. I mean, we teach constitutional law in our classes, and I have to say these days, every time I see students, I have to begin by saying, if you asked me today what Indian constitutional law is, I actually cannot give you a straight answer.
Do you therefore feel let down by the court?
Let down is a mild word. I mean, and I think in the court's case even more so, because of all the institutions, it has secured for itself the most statutory independence possible. It appoints itself, right? Of all the professions you can think of, right? The upper echelons of the legal profession are probably least at risk, right? In terms of, what do they fear would the government do to a Supreme Court judge if they actually gave a principled judgment, right? So this should have been the paradigm case of an independent institution, right, that has all the statutory provisions necessary to discharge justice, and yet that institution fails. So how can we actually blame, other institutions like the media and so forth?
You're suggesting it's absolutely inexplicable that the Supreme Court isn't standing up for the very values it's committed to uphold.
Absolutely, it's absolutely inexplicable, and the only explanation is that they are willing parties to this government's agenda.
Another form of complicity. Against this background, how do you view the popular protests, led on the one hand by Young India, led on the other by Muslim women in places like Shaheen Bagh? And these protests have continued for 6 weeks and they show no sign of slackening. How do you view them?
So at one level, these protests are absolutely remarkable, and Indian democracy does surprise you. They have certainly lifted the pall of fear, as everybody is invoking that phrase Nehru used about Gandhi. And I think one of the most important things they have done is, one of the things in a democracy is that often people take positions based on their perception of what public opinion is, right? And we often construct what that public opinion is through silences. If nobody is speaking out, it must be because absolutely everybody agrees with what's going on. So I think the moral importance of these protests actually cannot be underestimated. It shows there are pockets of resistance. The wonderful thing about these protests have been the invention of a new vocabulary and grammar of protest. Frankly, the idea that you would have tens of thousands of people reading the preamble to the Indian Constitution as a form of protest, asserting that as their primary identity, is truly astonishing. It's drawing some very clear red lines in the sand. Discrimination is not acceptable. It is empowering new constituencies, particularly students and, as you said, the women of Shaheen Bagh, right? So in that sense, it's been an extraordinary achievement that one should not belittle, and one shudders to think, right, how easy the game for the government would have been in the absence of these protests.
Let me ask you two questions. To what extent are the women of Shaheen Bagh, and by the way, Shaheen Bagh is not just Shaheen Bagh, there are multiple Shaheen Baghs in almost every city, and the young of India, to what extent are they both actually effectively challenging the Modi vision of authoritarianism, of majoritarianism?
I think they are challenging the Modi vision, I think, in three ways. One, as I said, they're, I think, very clearly articulating that whatever else our disagreements might be, clear constitutional discrimination is simply not acceptable, right? So it's drawing a very clear moral line. I think second, they are challenging, I think, the Modi vision by saying that, look, such concentration of power cannot go uncontested, right? And third, they are challenging the Modi vision by saying the government's attempt to inculcate fear shall not work, right? These are young people who are willing to risk a lot, and through that, in a sense, calling the government's bluff that we shall not be intimidated. So to that extent, right, I think they're fundamentally challenging the Modi government's vision. Now, there's a larger political question. Is this protest enough to direct the government either to a new course of action or to displace it from power? That, I think, is a different question. And frankly, the jury is out. If history is any guide, there's reason to be a little bit pessimistic on that score. One simple way of putting the problem, I think, as your column also indicated this morning, is this protest needs to be accompanied by an electoral strategy in places like UP, right?
And that's missing.
That's completely missing. Second, and this is my big fear, which is the government has a lot of staying power, right? Because it has the electoral mandate behind it. And it is going to use these protests to unleash another cycle or excuse for repression. It's already building up to it.
And
that's exactly what you
young Mr. Verma were doing.
That's exactly what they are, in a sense, building up to. That's exactly what Yogi Adityanath has used as a pretext. Right?
And this is precisely what Amit Shah meant when he said, press the button when you vote so hard that an electric current goes
right?
to Shaheen Bagh.
Exactly, right? The question is, will we be able to mobilize in large enough numbers to resist that kind of repression when it actually gets unleashed?
And can it continue for long enough? What's your answer to both of those?
So I think these protests can continue for a while.
They won't taper off.
I actually don't think they will taper off. And I think they've actually found a kind of sustainable model in some ways. But as I said, I'm not convinced that these protests are a threat to government.
Until they get some sort of political guidance behind them.
Until they get some kind of political guidance behind them. Or not political guidance, frankly, they are leading politics. But this has to translate into opposition politicians thinking very differently about what's at stake in Indian democracy.
I'll come to that in a moment's time, but let me ask you one more question about these protests. How significant is it that Muslim women, young Muslim boys, Muslim men are now protesting not as Muslims so much, but as Indians who uphold the Constitution and are defending the Constitution, and on those grounds, constitutional grounds, actually saying the CAA is wrong. In other words, not only have Muslims identified themselves with the Constitution, but they've also, in a very real sense, moved out from their local communities and tried to join the mainstream along with Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians.
So, look, Karan, let me be sort of a little kind of blunt on this, which is, I think our presumption has to be that most Indians of any religion actually speak a constitutional language and live within that constitutional framework. And one of the reasons I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the way the question has been posed is that sometimes the BJP uses this canard that, the minorities somehow are claiming a whole series of constitutional exceptions, are not joined in a sense to the mainstream in some ways. I've actually never thought that about minorities. Sure, there are deep disagreements over a whole range of issues, right? But it's hard to argue. In fact, India would not have survived as a nation if all our communities had not participated in some senses in this constitutional project, right? I think what is significant and what is I think more interesting about this moment is that while these protesters, and they are protesters from all communities, I mean, there are differing numbers of how many non-Muslims are there. I actually think the number is larger than the number that's being floated around, which is 1 in 4 or 25%. I think the poignancy of this moment is that it is the ruling party that has been forced to use an unconstitutional language in its response, right? Whereas these protesters have cloaked themselves both in the flag, which the ruling party had claimed on its own, and in a sense in the preamble of the Constitution.
And Ambedkar as well.
And Ambedkar is it. As far as women's agency goes, look, one of the important things is that we actually don't have data on this, but women have been a silent force shaping in Indian electoral politics for actually quite a while now, I think, in some ways. So in that sense, it's actually not surprising, right, that on something as fundamental as a law that questions the right of Indian Muslims to be citizens, you would have them breaking out.
Let's then come to the opposition. We're coming to the end of this interview. At a time when the country is deeply politically divided, at a time when it faces a serious economic crisis, do you think the opposition, and I suppose I mean Congress in particular, has the capacity to use this? In normal circumstances, Congress should be riding at the top. It's actually collapsed at the bottom.
I mean, that's $1 million question. So, does it have the capacity? I think one way of thinking about the question, and I think this is something that is, I think, angering a lot of Indians against the opposition, is the following, which is, if in a time of such deep national crisis, where you think everything fundamental about India is at stake, its constitutional values, its economic future, its basic political identity, we are still not seeing evidence of most of the opposition political parties or members of them thinking beyond their short-term interest within that party, right? I think that's the, so for example, with the Congress party, you will hear congressmen often say, the party is poor, starved of funds. Actually, individual congressmen can quite bankroll the party out if they wanted. I mean, I'm just giving a very quotidian, prosaic example, right? If you want to build an effective electoral alliance against the BJP 3 years from now, you have to start working together now. Maharashtra was a little bit of a ray of hope. You have to make sure that the states that you are governing, and I'm thinking of Congress specifically in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, you govern in a way that the voters in those states don't turn their back on you in 3 years. And again, we are just not seeing the sustained attention and effort, right?
You're suggesting that these are opportunities which the opposition and Congress in particular are squandering.
Absolutely squandering. I mean, and many would argue that, the silver lining in that is precisely because there's no opposition that a new civil society has had to emerge. But in the absence of a political party actually having an electoral strategy, I'm afraid these civil society gains could dissipate quite fast.
Are the Gandhis part of the problem that Congress faces?
See, to my mind, that's an irrelevant question, because the first rule of politics is nobody voluntarily gives up political power.
And they're not going to.
And any genuine leader who emerges by claiming political power. I mean, even Sitaram Kesri actually challenged the leadership, right? So the issue is not whether if anybody in Congress feels that the Gandhis are part of the problem, which many of them voice in private, right? I think the bigger question is, why don't they get together and challenge them, right? What is it about, you might say, the broader liberal establishment that the Congress claims to be, right? That it has no fight left in it, right? To me, that's the bigger problem. And in that context, the Gandhis often come across as the indispensable figures that hold the party together. Right.
Is that the problem, that the broader liberal establishment, which should be the opposition to Modi's apocalyptic vision, actually lacks leadership? A few regional leaders, maybe Mamta, maybe DMK, but that's it.
It actually lacks two things. It lacks leadership, but frankly, because that liberal establishment, we're using liberal loosely, had become the establishment, it had actually forgotten what it means to do grassroots outreach. Right? That's where actually the BJP has a huge advantage. It has so many civil society organizations, from the RSS to a whole range of other organizations, in a sense doing the daily business of propagandizing and outreach. In a state like UP, for example, you actually can't name 4 Congress party leaders who are mesmerizing orators in Hindi.
And you can't name them from the BSP or SP either.
Who could actually hold a crowd together for
so our
an hour and a
liberal
half.
parties, which could be the core of an opposition to Modi, actually lack contact on the ground with the people that can vote them back.
They actually lack contact on the ground. They actually lack the language and the idiom in which to communicate.
So it's going to be a long time before these parties, individually or collectively, are in a position to electorally seriously challenge the BJP.
Yes, the only way in which you can compensate for that is actually by banding together, right?
Which
and
they're not
consistently banding, which is something they're not doing.
So in addition to squandering the moment of opportunity these spontaneous mass nationwide protests have provided, they also lack the cohesion, the organization, the contact on the ground, or the capacity to band together. Both ways, they're damned.
Absolutely, both ways they're done. And one of the, I think, big lessons of history is that right-wing parties don't split. Whatever the differences may be in the BJP, right? They don't split off in any serious way. The left and center are too busy fighting each other to actually get their act together.
My last question, do you ever see Rahul Gandhi as Prime Minister?
Look, sometimes circumstances make Prime Minister. Did we think Rajiv Gandhi would become Prime Minister?
Or Manmohan Singh?
And did we actually think once Rajiv Gandhi won with 400 seat majority that he would squander it away so difficult? So I think that depends on circumstances, what actual electoral arithmetic looks like. But I think the bigger challenge is going to be whoever is going to be Prime Minister, and whoever from non-BJP is going to be the Prime Minister, will they command the kind of authority and legitimacy to be able to put back together this constitutional culture which this government is in the process of breaking. So the issue is not just winning, right? The issue is actually returning India in some senses, or clearing away the debris that this government will have left behind.
Which is why you fear that Mr. Modi may have changed our country, our people, our life forever.
Yes, at least for the foreseeable future.
On that rather depressing note, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.